What are the best songs from Psalm 11? I'm Daniel Mount, joined today by my co-host, Pastor Chad Berry, and we'll answer that question on today's episode of the Expository Songs podcast. We've each picked 5 or 6 songs, and we haven't compared notes. Since I have 6, I will kick things off. At number 6, I have a versification or a hymn called I Take My Refuge in the Lord, introduced anonymously in the OPC URCNA 2016 hymnal. This is a strict versification. The music is minor key. It might not quite be Celtic, it might not quite be folk, but it has hints of both. And the lyrics are in the best tradition of strict versification. And by that I mean they come as close as possible to the wording of each part or each verse of the psalm, within fitting in an English metrical and sometimes rhyming scheme. And of the versifications, I do think this is the best of the strict versifications, the verse by verse settings, traditional settings. Pastor Chad, what song do you have at number 5?
So at number 5, I did Psalm 11 by Brian. I believe his last name is pronounced Sauvé, which is quite a clever last name. It was, excuse me, the lyric is pretty good. It's fairly singable melody. I believe it would kind of fit in more of a modern hymn category. It's pretty straightforward. It's fairly rhythmic. I put it towards the bottom of the list mainly for 2 reasons. It stood out to me. It was a really great song. But I put it a little lower on my list. One, the melody is it's not what I would call completely anthemic, but it's a little bit more upbeat. And I think there's a degree of sobriety to Psalm 11. And so I don't think the melody communicated the mood of the psalm as well as a lot of others did. And there were all the songs above this one, I think had a stronger lyric than that one did.
I really like this one too. It isn't in my top 6, but it was the last one I cut. It's one of several runners up. But if I had done a top 7, it would have been number 7. It was right up there till the end. It was the last one I cut before I got down to my final list. I really liked it too. At number 5, I have Flee as a Bird to Your Mountain, written by Mary Dana Shindler in 1840. It's a beautiful hymn, and its title phrase is clearly drawn from verse 1. That said, I put it at number 5 because I don't think the hymn and the psalm use the phrase in the same way. The psalm is saying because we trust in the Lord, we don't have to flee when the wicked attack us. The hymn encourages us to flee to a mountain, using a mountain as a symbol for rest, not as a symbol for flight. And the first verse is, Flee as a bird to your mountain, thou who art weary of sin. Go to the clear flowing fountain where you may wash and be clean. Fly, for the avenger is near thee. Call, and the Savior will hear thee. He on his bosom will bear thee. O thou who art weary of sin, O thou who art weary of sin. And this when it says, go to the clear flowing fountain, that reference suggests to me that this hymn might be using mountain as a reference to Calvary. So because it's using the phrase in a different sense than the psalm uses it, I would classify it as an allusion rather than as a reference. But with that said, allusion or not, it is a beautiful hymn with a beautiful melody. I'd heard it before in passing, but I hadn't really appreciated how pretty it was before going through songs for this episode. It's probably the nicest song overall that's directly drawn from this psalm. I can't rank it higher because it's not taking one of the main themes of the psalm. It's not setting it to music. It's a passing reference. But it is such a pretty song that I had to give it a shout out somewhere in the list.
I think that brings me to number 4.
It sure does.
And at my number 4, I've got In God Will I Trust, performed by Fitting Praises. I liked this one. Again, the lyric is pretty good. Some of the others, I think, just have a stronger lyric. It's stuck pretty tight to the words of the text. I liked this one a little bit better than Sauvé's piece because it's singable in any context. It's got a very it almost feels kind of like an And Can It Be or an I Sing the Mighty Power of God. It's got a very rhythmic melody, very easy to sing. And as we've talked about many times, and I know as you talked about the last couple episodes with the worship review guys, I mean, this would be a great song to introduce to a congregation who's trying to introduce and learn singing the Psalms. I thought it was really well done. It's done in the recording on YouTube is a choral piece, which, so if people are used to singing choral music, they could easily pick up on parts and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that would be an easy one to add into a worship set.
Neat. My Psalm 11 is a little unexpected. Not a source or type I typically pull from too much for these top lists for a reason, but I also think, despite that, this one belongs. This one has a place in the top 5, and that's just simply titled Psalm 11 by The Corner Room. The Corner Room is a project that sets the ESV translation of the Psalms to music word for word. And I don't do too many word for word settings, but I'll elaborate on that in a moment. This arrangement is really energetic and well done. It features, largely bluegrass instruments, although they're not played in an especially bluegrassy way. There isn't the banjo rhythmic pattern, high low medium, high low medium, high low medium, like you get from the Flatt and Scruggs era bluegrass. But it's the bluegrass instruments. There's a prominent dobro, for instance, and they use verse 4 as a sort of chorus that repeats. Now, I definitely include songs in these lists for personal edification, but I bias my list somewhat toward, could this work congregationally, either in my setting or in another that I've been in that I have some familiarity with. And most word for word settings have a whole psalm. They set the whole psalm to music word for word. Just wouldn't work congregationally flat out. This one might be a little more challenging than the songs I picked in my top 3, but I actually think it's doable, especially for a congregation that's really motivated to sing the Psalms. You can always sing strict versifications, but once in a while there's a setting that sets every word of it in the English to something that you can actually sing and learn. And there's definitely benefit for the enhancement of our own scripture memory if we do that. So I had to give this one a shout out in my top 5.
That one was pretty high on my list. Like it probably would have been, had we done like a top 10, it probably would have been on my top 10.
Yeah, it was surprisingly good. I always appreciate what they do. It often just doesn't quite fit what I'm looking for here, of something that is either so memorable that you're going to be singing it at church and pick it up within a time or two, because good congregational music, the congregation has to be able to pick it up within 2 or 3 times, because you don't sing stuff every week. So if it's hard to pick up, they'll just never get the hang of it. And then good music for personal edification doesn't have to be quite as easy to pick up. It still has to be fairly easy to pick up for it to be something you're just singing as you're going around your house. And this one is.
Excellent.
So what do you have at number 3?
At number 3, I've got Refuge, Psalm 11 by My Soul Among the Lions. I chose this one for several reasons. There's a the lyric is really strong, and there's a line in particular, I believe it's in the second verse, and I didn't put it down direct quote, but it refers to that there are signs all around that serve as monuments to God's care. And I was really gripped by that concept of, as we think about the nations raging, that's more of a Psalm 2 reference, but as we think about the enemy's bow bending, and as we think about trials that may come or persecution that may come, we can also look around and we see all the pillars of God's faithfulness. And so the lyric was really strong, and I really liked the mood of this particular song, because I feel like it communicated the mood of the psalm really well.
Yes, and that section you referenced in the lyric is, "In the Lord I take refuge. Why do you counsel despair, when all around us the signs of God's blessings form monuments to his care?"
Such a good line.
It's a really good lyric.
Good line.
And for those reasons, the quality of the lyric, the quality of the melody, this was my number 2. So I'll skip ahead a little bit. This is my number 2. My Soul Among Lions has 2 songs based on this psalm. And I resonate with everything you said. The only other thing I'd throw in is that the lyric is particularly focused on the first 4 verses of the psalm, reassuring believers who are in a non-optimal position, let's say under attack, of God's sovereignty and his power. So that was your number 3.
Yeah. And your number 2.
And that was my number 2.
So I'll do my number 2.
Sure, and then I'll do my number 3.
Okay, and then we'll both be at number 1 after that, right?
Yes.
I think so. Okay, so for my number 2, I've got Behold His Face by Jamie Souls.
Okay.
I'll just be honest. I'm a little bit of a sucker for his music.
Me too.
Really, really like his music. It's not a strict versification, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be if I remember right, the YouTube recording is a little bit more razzmatazz, but it would be a pretty easy song to strip down and just do on a guitar or do on a piano. And it would be a little bit trickier. The melody would be a little bit trickier than like In God I Will Trust by Fitting Praises, but it would be pretty easy to sing congregationally, I think. And it's just a really good versification. And I really wanted to have at least one pretty close versification represented in my top 5. And anytime I can shout out Jamie Souls is a good day.
That was also one of my runners-up. And where Brian Sauvé's was the last to be cut, if I'd had a top 7, if I'd had a top 8, Jamie Souls, Behold His Face was the second last to be cut. And if I had done a top 8, it'd have been number 8. So, definitely. So that was your number 3. I'll do my number 2, which is also titled Psalm 11, just like one of my other picks there. Simple title Psalm 11, written by Ryan Flanigan with an anonymous lyric and recorded by Liturgical Folk, his group. This isn't a word-for-word setting of Psalm 11, although it's pretty close. What it actually is it's a word-for-word setting of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer version of the Psalms, which I believe is Anglican. As best as I can tell, the Book of Common Prayer is a non-rhyming paraphrase. So it goes into English meter, but doesn't trouble itself with perhaps stretching things a little to make it rhyme. It uses verse 4 as a repeating refrain, but otherwise it follows the Book of Common Prayer text pretty closely. For a congregation that's accustomed to singing the kinds of songs we're accustomed to, which, rhyme and they have meter usually, those kinds of hymns and modern hymns, this one would be a learning curve for a congregation like ours. But I do think it's a doable learning curve, and this is a fairly approachable song. And it was kind of nice to be able to pull from a tradition that I haven't pulled much from in this series. That was a really nice setting of the psalm, I thought. So what do you have at number 1?
I think that brings me to number 1.
Sure does.
So at number 1, I have God Hasn't Moved by the SHIYR Poets. Okay. And so I'll plug in a footnote here.
It might be SHIYR Poets. It may be
so
you did check? Okay.
I took special note when I was at the top. I think it was the top 5 of Psalm 10 that you did with the worship guys.
And I wasn't sure.
And that came up as a discussion.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of brilliant recognition of the Hebrew. I think he said it was the Hebrew word for song or the Hebrew word for sing. And so I went to their website this afternoon to see if there was any reference. Now, I found out one thing, but not the other. I was going to see, is that what it is? Is it the Hebrew word for song? They don't specify whether or not there's any correlation there. However, they do specify that it's pronounced SHIYR.
Okay. So if it's SHIYR, then it probably is the Hebrew word, and probably isn't a subtle Tolkien reference. So many artists love Tolkien. There's so many Tolkien references around and about that I kind of defaulted to assuming that. But he had a really good point in the last episode, and you have a great point here.
Yeah.
That probably is what it is.
And had I not gone and looked it up, I probably still would, because that's what I thought it was too. The SHIYR Poets, because their music even has kind of a slight Scottish Celtic feel to it, anyways, but this song was just, it's the one I kept coming back to. Usually whatever I said at number 1 is the one that I come back to again and again and again. And I think to myself, man, that's a good song. And the part of this song that I particularly liked, there were 2 elements. One, the mood of the song, I don't know exactly the key arrangement and everything, but they did a really good job at capturing both the sobriety of Psalm 11, that there is an enemy who bends their bow, that there is hardship in this world and in this life, but that we also have an unchanging God who is sure and steadfast. And so musically they captured that kind of now and not yet sort of tension that we live in. I thought they captured the tension of Psalm 11 really well in the music. And then in the middle of the song, there's this bridge portion where it communicates that idea that our God is unchanging and that he's always there. And there's this part where they repeat the line, the Lord is in his holy temple. And each time it builds, and then it builds, and then it builds. And then as it builds, there's just this great reminder that God stays the same and that he's always there, that even though he may feel distant, that he's not actually distant. And so we don't have to retreat because our God hasn't retreated and he's right there with us. And I just really, really loved this song, that he is in his, I think the word that they used on the end of that build is that he is ruling. And how true that is, that even when it might seem chaotic around us, that God is still in his holy temple. He is still on the throne. He is still in control, and we need not retreat. We need not fear, and we need not flee. And so I really loved what they did with this setting. It's not particularly singable. It could work easily in our context as like an offertory song.
Yeah.
I don't think that we would ever try to do it congregationally. Churches who are more accustomed to like really contemporary music probably could pull it off, though.
Yeah, I mean the most familiar writer and name in the group is Brian Dorkson, who we know for "Come Now Is the Time to Worship" and some other praise songs.
Yeah, so, I think "Refiner's Fire" is another one that he wrote.
Yeah. So definitely he's praise and worship is more his comfort zone. And I didn't have that in my top 5 or 6 just because I didn't. Yeah, I felt like the approachability, the learnability, I biased my list maybe even too much to would it work in our context, but that's always part of my thought process. And you have a great point, definitely would work as an offertory. So at number 1, I have one that has a different musical feel to it. And I get and I understand what we've said about the feel of the psalm. And the song I have at number 1 is "Come Now, My Friend" by Mentzel Among Lions, their other setting of the song. And I don't want to sound like a broken record with how much I put their songs at the top of the rankings, but they really stand as a class to themselves in that there just isn't another modern artist that goes throughout covering all the themes of a psalm this well in their lyrics, with both a modern treatment for the lyrics and a modern treatment for the melody in high quality professional modern production. And this song seems to be written as an intentional parallel to their other Psalm 11 setting, which is Refuge, which we both had in our top 5. And I say intentional. Jody Killingsworth, who's one of the main people associated with the group, he is a co-writer on both. He wrote this one solo, co-wrote the other one with Jake Mentzel. And Refuge is really focused toward believers and has a theme of reassurance. And it's just like this calm, reassuring, comforting musically and lyrically setting of the psalm. This lyric, interestingly, has unbelievers in mind, at least somewhat. And it brings out a different aspect of the psalm, which I think is there. I don't know if it's the primary, because the primary way you understand the song is understand it as believers. But this brings confidence and energy. And that's there because you see the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence his soul hates. And then you look at verse 7, for the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. His countenance beholds the upright. You can say those in a calm, reassuring way, which is what Refuge brings out. But, the psalm's talking in part about the wicked and for the wicked's consideration. And when you're speaking to the wicked and you say, the Lord is in his holy temple, there's a confidence to that. And this song brings out that confidence side. And I kind of like that. I kind of liked having from the same writer, a take on it with the reassurance for the believers, and then this other take with the confident declaration of God's sovereignty to reassure believers and for the consideration of unbelievers. I kind of liked how the two together brought out two different sides of the psalm depending on who's hearing it. So that intrigued me so much that I put them both near the top of my rankings. Were there any other songs that you had as runners-up that we haven't talked about yet?
So here's what I decided to do this time.
Oh, okay.
I actually think that in terms of quantity of songs, Psalm 11 does not have a ton. It's not a long list. But what I noticed is it's a pretty strong list. Like, as I listened through the songs, I'm like, man, there's a lot of really good. And so the way that I'm going to shout out the runners-up is just go listen through the expository songs database on Psalm 11, because like if I were to put in runners up, John Michael Talbot had a really great setting of the psalm. The Corner Room, the Psalms Project had a really great setting of the psalm. There were just so many where it was like, man, it'd be hard for me to shout that one out individually and not that one. So my encouragement would be go to the Psalm 11 page on the database, on the expository songs database, and just start listening. Build a playlist and start listening, because while these are the 5 that really stood out and gripped me, there were several that were really, really, really good. And almost too many to mention, because I mean, I don't know if you felt the same way, Daniel, but I really felt like, though it wasn't a huge quantity, especially when you compare to like Psalm 23, which just has hundreds and hundreds of songs, but it was strong. There were a lot of strong settings to it.
Yeah, I did feel similarly. There were plenty. There's always some that I don't think are as strong as others.
Sure.
And, I don't want to be too critical. I don't dwell on those. Don't talk about the ones that aren't so strong as much, unless there's a really interesting theological point to mention, like I did with one song in the Psalm 7 episode. But generally speaking, I just leave those be. But I think it was Psalm 10 where I had 3 top picks I was pretty happy with. And I really had, it was either 10 or 9, one of the recent ones. And I really had to dig and go through and listen again, like, okay, I think I can go with those as number 4 and 5. This one I had about a top dozen or top 15 that I thought were all pretty strong, and that I could make a case for each of them to be in the top 5. And that doesn't happen with every psalm. I would say that final cut where I'm like, okay, I'm down to the point where every one of these songs has a case to be in the top 5. To have 12 or 15 for a song that doesn't have that many settings, I would tend to agree. I think there were a lot of good ones. I did have one other runner-up that we haven't mentioned, and it's a song I'm sure we both love. It's just not primarily I primarily associate it with another passage, and that is "The Lord is in His Holy Temple" by Keith and Kristen Getty. And the wording of their song is a clear reference to that same phrase, which also shows up in Habakkuk 2:20. The Lord is in His holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before Him. There's really no question that's the primary point they're referencing. That same wording, that phrase, shows up in Psalm 11:4, the Lord is in His holy temple. And as such, a congregation that already knows that song, or a congregation that sings a lot of Getty songs, could make profitable use of it here, because that phrase appears here. It's just, I think of it as primarily a Habakkuk 2:20 song, and I'd be very surprised if we did a Habakkuk 2 episode and it wasn't one of my top picks. It's just because it's so clearly on the Habakkuk side of the two, that I leaned toward having it as a runner-up rather than a top pick, even though as a song and as a performance of the song, it would easily be worthy of a top 5. So our next segment is the retuning challenge, which are lyrics that we really like that could use a retuning or a new melody. Did you have any picks here?
Yeah, just one. Since I've placed my trust in God, by
Okay.
Isaac Watts.
Okay.
It's long. There's 7 verses. I won't read all of them.
Yeah, pick one or two maybe. Yeah.
But in verse 2, he talks about placing trust in the Lord in verse 1. And then in verse 2, he builds into this in a way that I just think is really genius. He says, "Behold, the wicked bend their bow and ready fix their dart, lurking in ambush to destroy the man of upright heart. When once the firm assurance fails which public faith imparts, 'tis time for innocence to fly from such deceitful arts. The Lord hath both a temple here and righteous throne above, whence he surveys the sons of men and how their counsels move." In some ways, I would probably put a little bit of a footnote under those lyrics, similar to what you mentioned. I can't remember if it was your number 4 song or your number 5 song, where I think he's kind of using the flight verse slightly differently than the psalm is doing, where he's saying, once faith fails, it's time to flee. And I don't necessarily think that that's what the psalm is communicating. I think it's communicating more steadfastness because of, it's asking the question, why should we flee? Because of how solid our God is. But I was particularly gripped by verse 2, where he talks about lurking in ambush to destroy the man of upright heart, because that's what's being communicated in the bending of the bow verse, is that we do wage war against, the world, the flesh, and the devil, as a lot of people usually say. And it's not our body that the enemy is going to seek to destroy. It's our soul. It's our heart. And so I loved how he kind of really stabbed at that vigilance towards character and an uprightness of heart.
I'm glad you picked that one, because I've picked Isaac Watts often enough that if this podcast were part of pop culture, me picking Isaac Watts would be a meme by this point.
Yeah. See, I've picked him enough, but it's been a few times since I have picked him that I felt like he was due to be represented again.
Yeah, because so often he has one of the best settings and the best setting that I don't have a good melody for. And I really liked his, but I do want to give other writers a chance sometimes. And I found another one by another writer who I wasn't at all familiar with that I thought was really strong, so I thought I'd mention that one today. And that is a hymn titled "My Trust is in the Lord," written by, I believe the lyric was anonymous, and Harvey Camp wrote the music. I may have that reversed. And it's just really simple, but it's elegant and clean. And very well done poetically. Very smooth. I'll just mention 2 verses as an example, but it sticks closely to the text of the psalm throughout. What can the righteous do? What can for them avail, when all foundations are destroyed and all the pillars fail? The Lord in Zion dwells, the Lord is throned on high. His eyes behold the sons of men, their hearts and way to try. Just there isn't a syllable out of place. It's very smooth, very well done, and sticks really closely to the ideas of the psalm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Before we conclude, could you take a minute to shout out your most recent book?
Yeah, sure. So Ecclesiastes, An Answer Key to Life's Big Questions. Short, simple read. It's available on Amazon. If you search that title or my name, Chad Berry, at Amazon, it'll come up. But honestly, the easiest way to get a copy would be to just contact Daniel through Expository Songs, or you can contact me via Facebook, and I'll just give you a copy.
Thank you very much for that kind offer. And listener, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and subscribe to catch future episodes. You can also find past episodes in the free 74,000 entry Expository Songs searchable database at expositorysongs.com. Thank you for listening.